Thank you for having us here tonight. I'm Hope Taft. I am involved as a co-founder of and co-chair of the Little Miami River Cleaners in the Little Miami Watershed Network. And Bob and I now live in outside of Bellbrook, Ohio, which is at the other end of the Little Miami River from what you have down here. And we have fortunate enough to have a house right on the Little Miami River, so I've learned to read it and to love it. And with me tonight is Aaron Rourke, who is the Southwest District Regional Manager for the Scenic Rivers program. And we've spent the day in Columbus at the first Scenic River Advisory Council meeting that they've had in years. And it was a very invigorating day, but it is a little tiring now. So we're, if I have trouble putting my words together, I hope you'll understand. Last year was the 50th anniversary year of the Ohio Scenic Rivers Act. And Ohio beat the federal Scenic Rivers Act by about 6 months. We did it in February and they did it in August. So we have a lot to be proud of. We were the first state in the nation to realize that water was important and that our scenic rivers was a wonderful heritage that we had that we needed to protect. And the Little Miami River was the first river in Ohio to get that status. And we got that status the year later in 1969. And so this is our 50th year for that. And we have come to realize that a lot of people don't know that much about the Little Miami River or even watersheds, and that we have a lot of education to do. So we appreciate your giving us this opportunity. Our goal is to give 50 talks because this is the 50th anniversary. So if you know of any place that you'd like us to come and present, please contact us because we would like to do that.
It's notable that the Little Miami is actually the inspiration of all the rivers in the state. It's the inspiration for the foundation of the state program. Glenn Thompson, Dayton Journal-Herald, editor, right? Publisher?
Right.
Was so enamored of the Little Miami. He thought it deserved special distinction, and so he was really the energetic force behind getting our state to start a program. And became the first in the nation. Pretty soon the federals did their own program, which protects so many iconic rivers, especially in the West, Colorado and Snake and several others that are Yellowstone, I think. But Little Miami is also on that list. It's a state and national scenic river.
And if you're in the post office, you can get this beautiful array of scenic river stamps. And they've got a lot of the rivers out west, but they don't have the Little Miami. Very disappointing. This is the watershed of the Little Miami. You can see how it goes through all those counties. And we'll talk about it in a little depth next. Here is the United States, and you see all those beautiful colors. The Mississippi Watershed is all the pink in the middle, and Ohio is part of that. The Ohio River flows into the Mississippi, which flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And in the Gulf of Mexico, there is a dead spot that's about the size of Texas. And that's a spot where there is no oxygen in the water, so nothing can live. And a lot of that comes from up here and the other upper reaches of the watershed.
You'll notice that Ohio, all the rivers in Ohio go to one of two places. They either go north into Lake Erie or south into the Ohio River, which then goes to the Mississippi into the Gulf. And about something like maybe, that was the Lake Erie watershed.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Do all those lines represent rivers, or are they just
Yes.
creeks and rivers?
Yeah.
Creeks and rivers. Does everyone know what a watershed is? It's like a giant bowl with a funnel at the end of it.
It's the catchment basin.
It's the catchment basin, and everything from the top drains down into the bottom, which is usually a river, and then it goes into a bigger river, and it goes into a bigger river. Like all the little streams and tributaries here eventually go into the Great Miami River, and then that goes into the Ohio River, and that goes into the Mississippi River, and that goes into the Gulf of Mexico.
And of all the rivers in Ohio that go down to the Gulf, and there's the dead spot Hope mentioned, the biggest river in Ohio is part of that watershed, that's the Muskingum. But the major contributor, the one with more farm runoff than anything else, is the Great Miami. And Cincinnati's bracketed by the Great and the Little, with Mill Creek actually being drainage for the city.
Isn't it unusual, though, for rivers to flow up?
You know, that's a common
Right?
misapprehension that actually they just flow to the nearest low spot. But I grew up thinking that rivers did generally flow north, and that was an oddity.
Well, they did before the last glacier, at least in Ohio, when they all went to the Taze River, but the glaciers pushed them all south.
Rearranged the drainage altogether. The whole Ohio River was formed as a result of the Taze, which was flowing north towards Fort Wayne, being stuffed, basically. It could not go north anymore. And a giant lake formed where that Taze River, which came out of North Carolina, was stopped by the southward flowing glacier. A big lake, like as big in total extent as maybe Lake Erie, but finally divided into lots of little valleys. It was called Lake Tite. Not that there was anybody around to talk about it at the time, but geologists refer to it as Lake Tite. And a great deal of silt and clay settled out of that lake over the several thousand years that it existed. And those clay deposits are the foundation of our ceramic industry over in, say, the Zanesville area. When I was a kid, I was raised in Chillicothe, and when we go over to Zaleski, we'd sometimes see people with their cars stopped along Route 50, I think it is. Yeah, and they'd be digging clay out of the bank because they were amateur potters. Have you seen that? Yeah, you can, well, until recently, you could still see the shovel marks, but the ODOT decided that was a traffic hazard, so they filled that with limestone chunks and obscured the clay layer.
So this, like orange up there and that little bit of pink, I assume that flows up north up into Canada then? I mean.
Like this? Is that
No, up
Over
there,
here.
like it's in North Dakota or something
Like
that.
here?
Right there.
Oh,
That
yeah.
must be flowing up into Canada because it's
Yeah.
not part of, right, the
Yeah.
same with the orange over on
Yeah,
west.
and the same with the green around where Ohio is and Michigan. All that flows into Lake Erie.
70% of Ohio's contribution to Lake Erie is through Scenic Rivers, by the way.
Yeah, you know Summit County, Portage County. That gives you a hint of what the geology is like. Summit County would be the dividing between the Lake Erie watershed and the Ohio watershed. And Portage was the area that was low enough for you to take your canoe over.
That's the high spot you had to drag your boat over to get from one drainage
Used
into
to
the
another.
next.
So if,
With
yeah,
no roads, the streams were the roads.
yeah,
So if you wanted to get from the French settlements in like Quebec to the French settlements at New Orleans, the way you did it was to go through Lake Erie, drag your boat over that divide, get into the Mississippi drainage and paddle all the way down there.
So here we are a little closer to home with the Ohio, the state of Ohio, and you can see the sort of the division there. Akron is right on the dividing line, and it goes all the way across the state.
Oh, it is right on the line.
Yeah.
Never noticed that.
And you can the Lake Erie watershed and the Ohio River watershed. And then the other little picture is of the Great Miami watershed in blue and the Little Miami watershed in green, and you can see why the Little Miami is called the Little Miami.
And you can see why the Great Miami contributes so much agricultural phosphorus and nitrogen. Those are the two. If you ever buy bags of fertilizer, you know it's phosphorus, nitrogen, and what's the third
K.
thing? Potassium. Correct, potassium. Well, of course, farms need exactly the same nutrients that a residential garden does, and phosphorus and nitrogen are the two important ones that come from livestock fertilizer. Livestock waste. We're such a meat-eating, dairy-consuming culture that we have a lot of cattle farms and chicken farms and hog farms and turkey farms. And a cow is producing 28 gallons of waste a day, maybe 4 gallons of milk. So a cow is a poop factory that produces milk as a byproduct. And you got to deal with all that. Spring, summer, fall, and winter. And what do they do with it? Well, they put it on crop fields. They don't put it through sewage treatment plants, obviously. They put it on crop fields to use as fertilizer. And some of it ends up in the waterways because imagine in the winter when the fields are frozen, you still have to get rid of the livestock waste.
So they still do that?
Yeah. Yep.
And some states now show that residential property is almost up to agricultural property in the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that come off of our lawns because we fertilized them, oftentimes at the wrong time of year, and it rolls off and goes into our waterways too.
See all that agricultural heartland up in the top of the Great Miami watershed?
Is there like some kind of hill system that pot that
Yes.
mix that?
Yes.
I wasn't
If,
aware.
if you drive up 75 to Toledo,
It's very subtle.
it's very subtle, but
But
you
there
will
are
come
high
over
spots.
some ridges, in fact, several ridges, and each one of those ridges was the outlying area of Lake Warren, which was the lake before it shrunk after the Niagara Falls was created and became Lake Erie.
Lake Erie used to be so much bigger. It extended way down here. That's the old Great Black Swamp, which was the last part of Ohio to be settled. It was such a swampy place and so difficult to drain that they didn't get to that till last. I think 1870s, a lot of that area was settled because Lake Erie used to be so much bigger. So the people that were trying to farm over here were trying to farm on old soggy lake bed.
And they finally
Learned that in my geography class.
All the Great Lakes are shadows of their former size. If you spend much time in Chicago, where I spent several years, you know that Chicago, the municipality, is actually on old lake bed. And you have to go out to the Palos Hills to the west before you finally get up out into what you might consider non-lake terrain.
Yeah. So all that blue area at one time was Lake Warren, and as you go north on 75, you can, if you're looking for it, you can go over the hills. Not so much on 75 anymore because it's all flat, but in the old roads, you could definitely tell where the ridges were.
Yeah, the lake shrank in stages. So maybe it was out to here at one point and then to here and shrank down to its normal size. And each stage where it was it had a given volume for a certain, say, a few hundred years or a few thousand years, it would create a beach ridge. And those beach ridges are used as roadways now. And you have to know what you're looking at because everything's developed, but the engineers recognize that's where we need to put the roads because they won't flood.
So did the glacier period come while that was all lake?
It caused that to be a lake.
It caused that to be a lake.
Before the glaciers were here, Lake Erie was probably a riverbed, and geologists call that the Aragon River. It was shale, and so when the glaciers came, the shale did not resist. It was not a resistant rock. It gave way, and so the glaciers scooped out broad troughs, which became our Great Lakes. If you notice, they're all linked. There was probably a river that linked them all before, and what we're seeing is the vastly scooped out beds of that ancient river system. And the Tays flowed up into it, potentially.
And then the ancient Detroit River flowed down into it and brought acid soil and sand with it that after the glaciers left, blew up and dried out and became what's now known as the oak openings. And if you're into plant life, it's one of the most interesting parts of Ohio because of its wide variety of plants.
It's kind of like prairie with a lot of oak trees dispersed throughout it. Just thought of the Tays. You can go see the Tays today if you want. You just have to go past the southernmost point that the glaciers reached because that original channel is still there. It's called the New River, and many of us have been there. Cliffy, beautiful, very rural.
It flowed into southeastern Ohio and up through just south of
Right
Columbus.
here.
There's the Tays School District just south of Columbus that got its name. And then it right through Dayton has given Dayton the wonderful aquifer that it has, and then on up into what is the headwaters of the Mississippi River.
So beneath us, including here in Reading, beneath us over almost all of Ohio, except we timed out, except the unglaciated part, which would be the Appalachian section here. Everything else has been glaciated, and when the glaciers came, they left thick deposits of sand and gravel. So the old bedrock surface is completely hidden. Ohio had a completely different look before the glaciers showed up. Had its own drainage system, its own hills and valleys and steep places, and that's all gone. It's all buried. If you go across I-70, say from north of Dayton by the airport over through Columbus, when you get to the easternmost of the Springfield exits, remember how Route 40 kind of crisscrosses the interstate many times because it was the old route to go east to west? The last Route 40 exit over here, if you were to drill down, it would be 600 feet before you'd hit that rock. All that debris was left by the glacier. A completely different landscape, and we can only imagine what it looks like now, or what it did look like.
But now that we're into geology, the area around here is called the Cincinnati Arch, It has some of the most world-famous bedrock because it's limestone filled with fossils.
Yeah.
And it's what was pushed up when the Appalachian Mountains were formed. You always have a push-up, and then you have a decrease, a trough, and then you have another push-up, a smaller one, and that smaller push-up is right here in Cincinnati.
When you go by a road cut and you see blue shale and then limestone, thin limestone layers, and then more shale, and you keep seeing those limestone layers, but the shale erodes away faster, so the limestone sticks out. It's thought that each of those limestone layers is the record of one hurricane. Mm-hmm. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. You can almost, but here's the thing, back then in the Ordovician period, there were no land plants. So if you'd been snorkeling in that Florida Keys environment, or like
mm-hmm.
the Bahamas,
mm-hmm.
and you'd stuck your head up and looked around at the islands, it would have been bare rock.
Mm-hmm.
There were no plants. Mm-hmm. There was nothing but sunlight and rock and water and weather. None of the life that we know was here.
Mm-hmm. And at one time, the Cincinnati area was like a plain, and that we've gotten our deep valleys from erosion. There were not mountains that were pushed up. It was all eroded away.
Yeah, the valleys are negative features, whereas you go out west and the hills are the positive features.
So now that you've had your geology lesson, go on.
Yeah.
So southeast of like Hocking Hills
Uh-huh.
area, is that what was undisturbed Ohio?
It is,
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm.
And
It's-
during that continental collision, when Europe and North Africa collided with America, there was no Atlantic Ocean for a while, and it's happened 3 times. The Appalachians have been pushed up and worn down 3 times.
Oh, I don't know that.
A lot of the sand from the Appalachians is now out in Colorado.
And we think we can control that.
Yeah, exactly.
Our lifetimes are so short, it's a wonder we can gain perspective on any of this. Well, anyway, the Hocking Hills, those thick sandstones, and there are also shales over there, that's all the debris that eroded off the west side of the Appalachian Mountains during the 3rd iteration. Not even the first. You know that, do you ever see that black shale that is 400 or 500 feet thick? If you go to Columbus, it's in all the ravines. It's called the Ohio Shale. That's the debris from the first of the 3 generations of the Appalachians. But imagine going down to Louisiana. If you go to New Orleans, well, and you see the delta of the Mississippi River, there were deltas like that came off the west side of the Appalachians, and all that mud and sand and debris came down onto Ohio. Later on, when that was rock, streams etched down through it, and now we walk at the bottom of those canyons and look up into those river delta sediments. That's what they are. Yeah.
And the Appalachians, I mean, yeah, southeast Ohio, the Appalachians, the Hocking Hills area, was rock was so strong that the ice from the glaciers couldn't penetrate them.
Couldn't
and that's,
override all that.
Yeah, couldn't override all that. And
So all the canyons that we now have resulted from that?
It's as if you were a mole burrowing through the subterranean strata under New Orleans today. If you were just working your way through all those sediments that have washed out of the Mississippi Basin, and they're many thousands of feet thick, that's what you're doing when you walk through the Hocking Hills. You're getting the insider's view of a river delta, looking at it from below.
Well, I remember the caves up that way.
And do you remember that the sandstone that you can see in those caves often has cross beds, and they are at angles to each other? That's all the sand that washed off the front of the delta out into the ocean.
That's how there's so many caves up there.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
Weak spots in the rock that the
Yeah.
water was able to erode.
So let's see what's next. We'll get back to Scenic Rivers, and there you can see when the first law in the nation was passed here in Ohio, and that the Little Mammy River was the first river in the state, and that it that had state scenic river status, and then it became the first river in the state that had national scenic river status. And that makes it special for many reasons, and we're going to go through some slides that will help us decide and learn why these designations are important. And Glenn Thompson is the man we have to thank for all of this. He was a editor of the Dayton Journal-Herald. He had some time here at the Cincinnati Enquirer before he went to Dayton. And his dream was to have a corridor of green along the rivers so that when you were on it, you had no idea that there was civilization around. I think that he got stressed out at work and that he would jump in his car with his canoe strapped on top, sort of like Charlie Taft of this area, and would go to the Little Miami River and get in his canoe and find the peace and quiet that his soul needed. As you can tell from this quote, it kind of makes you think of that, right? He loved the river. In 2019, Ohio had 15 designated scenic rivers, totaling 831 miles. 3 of them have state and national designation. And the one thing to remember is that private property rights are not impacted anyway by the state scenic river law.
Still today, people come to township meetings and say, we don't need this scenic river designation, that's a taking. In fact, the United Nations is behind it. It's part of Agenda 21. It's all a vast conspiracy.
It's all wrong.
Yeah. How many years, 50 years into this, we're still countering these same arguments.
I can do anything with my property I want. Now, if ODOT decides it wants to build a bridge right through that area or across the river, then there is an advisory council that will look at that and say, well, why don't you think about doing this, or have you considered that? But
And
it's
local
all
people on that council.
It's all local people.
The Great Miami doesn't have such a council because it's not a state scenic river. So there's actually more local control in the case of a scenic river.
So along the river, there's not sewers all along there, right?
You mean combined sewer overflows? Is that what you're thinking of? Because
Well,
Cincinnati
no,
has such a problem with that?
There are a lot of sewer
It-
treatment
it's-
plants.
I'm sorry?
There's a lot of sewer treatment
One of
plants.
those treatment plants.
About 16 of them.
I canoe the river a lot, but I'm thinking, you can't really put a leach bed down near the river, and sewers that you got in the country a ways, I mean, I can't believe there's sewers running all along the river there so where's the sewage going?
There are, well, a lot of the things in the rural area are in septic tanks, and if people don't keep their septic tanks clean and up to maintain, then
They fail.
and all of that eventually ends up into the river because it's going to go downhill.
There are still places also where some rural families have their original setup, which is a septic system for part of the house, for the bathrooms, but the gray water from the kitchen goes right into the local creek. And it's much worse in other states, in particular Kentucky. People who are doing our work down there just pull their hair out at all the straight pipes, as they call them, that go right to the creek. It's not so much of a problem here, but it's not unknown. I've seen it myself.
Yeah. Here it's more controlled by the Soil and Water District and by the zoning of the township or the city.
Did you say there were 6 sewage treatment plants that
More
on
like-
the Little Miami?
More like 16.
16. This years ago, my brother knows something about this. Anyhow, he just casually, we were supposed to go canoeing. I was worried, man, it's been hot and dry, and my nephew was coming. I thought, oh, I feel bad for Adam. We're going to have to drag these. We get there, and the water's flowing. I go,
Yeah.
look at that. And I said, I was afraid. And my brother just says, well, no, half the volume is sewer effluent.
Exactly right. It's absolutely
Yeah,
correct.
it's a
This-
well-known fact.
It
And
was stunned me. I had no idea.
the delivery operators don't advertise that.
Yeah,
It'll be
no,
fine.
yeah,
That's before
yeah.
it gets to the treatment plant.
No,
Well,
that's
no,
after.
after
all-
the treatment.
It's, in many cases, it actually would meet drinking water standards, but just the thought of it is unappealing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 16, you said, along
Yeah.
the Little Line.
Yeah.
And particularly in the fall, in these recent fall, this year's fall, when we haven't had any rain, almost all the water in the Little Miami is from wastewater treatment
That's the
plants.
situation we were
Yeah.
in that summer, and that's why I was,
Yeah.
oh,
Mhm.
okay.
That's probably better than I know in Cincinnati, when you have a lot of rain, the treatments can't keep up, so they are dumping raw sewage.
They are.
Exactly,
They are.
exactly.
You know,
And the only place that happens in the Little Miami is way down here, like by the Duck Creek area. So the last few miles of a 107-mile long river are the only places where they have combined sewer overflows.
And is that scheduled to be
Yeah,
amended?
it's
or-
part of that EPA consent
Yeah.
decree that's going to take 20 years to fix.
But not, so no, not next year.
No,
No.
I think, isn't Cincinnati maybe 6 years into that plan? It's a while.
Yeah.
Columbus just made an interesting, we were just talking about rain
Mhm.
gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Columbus decided they have the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
Dayton doesn't, by the way.
No.
Their city fathers kept their sewers separate from the get-go. They are not combined sewers. That's the origin of the problem. Anyway, in Columbus, they've just changed their stormwater utility so that if you own a property that's 1 acre and it has a quarter of its surface area in impervious surface, like roofs,
Driveways.
roads, driveways,
Mm-hmm.
parking lots,
Mm-hmm.
you'll be billed by how much impervious surface you have. So if you create a rain garden on your property, which nullifies the impervious surface because all of your rainwater goes into that rain garden and then percolates down in the aquifer, getting purified all the way down, you will minimize your bill or nullify it.
This is that, our company, we've got a big building with a flat roof and a
Mm-hmm.
parking lot, so
Yeah.
our water bill, we're being charged for.
Mm-hmm.
For the
Runoff.
amount you contribute, yeah, in
Mhm.
way of runoff. You can make your property into a little zero runoff watershed, its own little containment basin.
Mm-hmm.
I think Cincinnati Zoo brags about having done that.
Mhm.
They're a demonstration project for rain gardens.
So you see that green area? That's the area that Aaron's in charge of.
Yeah. Greenville Creek and Stillwater River up here.
We have 3 scenic rivers in Aaron's area. We'd like more, particularly in the purple and the green spots. So if you know
The two that
people,
are on the bubble are the Mad River and Paint Creek. Everybody loves the idea over here, so that's going very smoothly. Paint Creek, the North Fork of Paint Creek, Rocky Fork Creek, and probably Rattlesnake Creek will all be one designation, and it'll be the single biggest one in Ohio.
so we better brag about the Little Miami while we can, because it's the longest one in Ohio right now.
Yep.
But you have to go through a process, and the Paint Creek and the Mad River are in the middle of that process right now. So the Little Miami River or Southwest Ohio has 3 of the 15 scenic rivers. You don't hear much about the Stillwater and the Greenville Creek down here, but we hear a lot about them up in the Dayton area, because they run, the Greenville Creek runs into the Stillwater River, and the Stillwater River runs into the Great Miami River.
Many of you probably know that most of Ohio was open to settlement by the Treaty of Greenville. That sound familiar? It's an historical society. I would think that would be a fact that's in general circulation around here. That occurred in what year? Anybody remember? 1795. Very good, yeah. 2/3 of Ohio was open to European American settlement. Tecumseh, remember what year did he die? Does anybody remember when he was killed in battle? 1813. So this was 18 years after that.
You're close.
You're doing well. You're keeping up. That's great. So there was an 18-year period during which he stewed and planned and eventually led a kind of an armed opposition. But for the first 3 years, while he was still seething about how some of his countrymen, you might say, had written off part of Ohio, at the intersection, the confluence of Greenville Creek and the Stillwater River on that little tiny point of land, he kept fires burning for 3 years in silent protest, because that was like the easternmost point where it was still legal for the Indians to live.
Where is that?
It's a little park in Darke County, and I think it's called Point Park.
In Greenville?
Yeah, it's right out there at Greenville.
Yeah, it would be right in Greenville. Yeah.
Is that the location where they had the show?
No, that was in Greene County,
Green County.
at a park that's now owned by
I
Metro
see
Parks.
that once when I was a kid with my mom and dad.
Do you remember the premise was that Blue Jacket was actually a white person who had been captured? Well, when DNA analysis became easily available, and it turns out that wasn't true because some of his descendants are living and known, the whole plot fell apart,
Oh, really?
and that's why that came to an end, yeah.
He wasn't?
No.
They had his
He was
name
not,
and everything.
he was not Marmaduke Van Swearingen. No.
Sorry about that.
He was Blue Jacket.
How do you think it got started then?
I don't know.
There's another outdoor one like that for 2.
There's one in Chillicothe
Copy.
that still goes. It's called Tecumseh exclamation point.
So there's no more Blue Jacket
No,
outdoor?
that is
You know,
no
people
more.
often think that whole settlement period happened just in a big flash. Blue Jacket was an elder when Tecumseh was a little kid. So they were probably never in the same battles.
So at least 2 or 3 generations.
That took a long time to
Mhm.
transpire.
Mhm.
Yeah. And think it was longer between the time Columbus showed up and all that happened than it has been since then.
Mhm.
And we think Tecumseh, that's ancient times. They had known about Europeans for centuries before it all came to a head in Ohio.
So I can see we're going to have to kind of race through these.
Yeah, we've got 85 slides and we're on number 10.
It's been a wonderful discussion. We like these signs up, we're part of the river that we're on, and you might see them. But
Here's
this
the
is
funny thing. Somebody put one of those up on the Great Miami, and then one of our river people sent it into us. The Great Miami is not a state scenic river.
No.
But they have such fans up there that somebody decided to have a sign made at his own expense and put it up next to the bridge.
But these are the things that if you wanted to be a Ohio Scenic River, you have to have, and that local interest letters and designation study and public comment period are really important. The most important thing is when the director of the Department of Natural Resources makes an entry into their official journal declaring that that river or that section of the river
It's
is,
like a ship's log or something. Yeah, they have a journal and they make an entry, and for 30 days, if nobody protests, after 30 days it becomes permanently official.
Yeah. So in order to make it, you have to have these qualities, and we're going to go through them real quickly. You have to have clear water, clean water. This is taken right outside our house, so you can see the bottom, so it's pretty clean. We do stream quality monitoring, water quality checking 3 times every year, and the reports have continued to come out that the water quality is good.
Yeah, it's exceptional warm water habitat.
Yeah.
That's the highest grade you can get in Ohio.
That's Mill Creek what you call it.
It's working its way up there.
It is certainly getting better. Since 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, that tide has risen all boats.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much that piece of federal legislation did for almost all Ohio streams.
So it has to have continuous filter strips or riparian forest buffer.
The riparian forest is the Riverside forest. That's the name for that kind of,
it's-
sycamore and cottonwood, silver maple. It's riparian forest.
And it's really important because it slows down rainwater that would drain down into the river, and it helps to purify it. Whereas water that comes through your stormwater system in your storm drains doesn't slow down anyway, doesn't get purified anyway, because it goes through a concrete pipe as fast as it can to get there.
I've asked, what do you consider, how wide is wide enough? And in the Scenic Rivers Act, it says a certain fraction of the length of river has to have woods out to 500 feet. And beyond that, the rest of it that doesn't meet the 500-foot criteria has to have at least 120 feet. And I thought, 120? 500, okay, I didn't even balk at that, but where'd you get 120? That's an odd number. Well, it turns out it's 2 canopy widths. So it's 2 tree widths. If you think of it, 1 tree width is a fence row, isn't it? And no forest-dwelling animal worth its salt is going to think of that as woods. Whereas 2 canopy widths begins to be shady enough with enough leaf litter and understory that maybe that would be a migration corridor for forest-dwelling birds or deer, other animals that don't like to be out in the open. They like to be undercover.
So this is State Line Road up just west of Dayton, between Indiana and Ohio. And you can tell from the pictures below which side is Indiana and which side is Ohio, because that is right at Greenville Creek. And if you look north, the part with all the trees is the Ohio part, and the part with very few trees is the Indiana part.
When you showed me this picture, you drove out there and took that, didn't you?
I sure did.
I remember thinking, how consistent in unexpected ways. Years ago, I did a quick analysis of our surrounding states to see who had the best scenic rivers program, because if you're going to advocate for conservation, but you're talking to, say, economic development people, you want to emphasize the value for tourism, maybe. So I wanted to know, how do we rank? Well, it turns out Indiana is the closest comparison. Indiana is very much like Ohio in terms of terrain and the fact that our streams almost all run all year because both states were heavily glaciated. Kentucky doesn't have a scenic rivers program. most of their streams dwindle to the point where they're not paddleable or fishable in the summer, and so people don't care as much about them. They don't become parts of people's collective memories about family events and so on. Same is true in West Virginia. There are a few federally designated scenic rivers, but they don't have a big scenic river program. Anyway, Indiana has about 10% of the scenic river miles. They do have a program, they just never bother to work it. Ohio invented most of the ways of monitoring the health of a stream that are now used nationwide. Somehow we've really been on the forefront, and this one set of pictures really captures that. Look at the thick protection on the stream, and Indiana just doesn't have it.
So,
We have a lot to be proud of.
What are those structures on the lower left there?
well, there's some bales of hay,
Round bales.
Oh, there's hay.
and then there's a farm in the distance.
Okay, yeah, they look like
And
shelters. This
yeah. One person said the Indiana side of this of Greenville Creek looked a lot wider and bigger than the Ohio side, and a lot of that is because those trees on the Ohio side have prevented
They
bank
anchor the banks.
erosion
Yeah.
and have protected it a lot. So that limited human intrusion, well, that means bridges, basically.
Right. If you're having a paddling experience on the Little Miami, they don't want an interstate highway roaring by.
But
Not
you
too
do
many
see
bridges.
this one. You do go under this one. This is the
Yeah.
Jeremiah Morrow Bridge.
Portrayed that way, it almost looks like an art project, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
It's actually got some inherent beauty.
But now you tell them what you like to tell them about this.
Oh yeah, this is the cool thing about this. Okay, we are looking downstream towards Cincinnati. There's the bike trail. If you are pedaling from, say, Marymount or Terrace Park or somewhere, you're coming up the bike trail and maybe your goal is to get to Yellow Springs. Well, when you get to this point, you're looking up at the bridge deck 230 feet up there. That's about the altitude you'll get to be, you'll be when you arrive in Yellow Springs. In fact, you'll get there at Xenia. But the climb is so imperceptible that even most cyclists I've talked to say they don't really notice. And that there's a whole coterie of cyclists who do this trip every weekend. They do like a 100-mile trip where they go up and then back. And I've said on the way back, do you notice you don't have to pedal as hard? They have to think about it, which that's my answer. No, you don't notice it.
But if you're at that bridge and on the river, you will drop that much again before you get to the Ohio River. So
Anybody
it's,
know the lowest point in Ohio? Like Death Valley is the lowest point in the country. What's the lowest point in our state? Now think this through, because everybody in here would come to the right conclusion.
Probably down to Harrison. isn't it?
Yeah, right. It's the point where the Ohio River, which is the master stream, drains out of our state. It's the state line, right?
it has high biological diversity, and that little critter on the stone is really important because that is the larva for the Dobson Fly, and it will only live in streams and rivers that have high water quality.
Right. It's the first thing to drop out. It's the most sensitive. It's a little water monster. They're about this long and they pinch. You know how crawdads pinch? So do hellgrammites. And they turn into a Dobson fly, which is a scary looking thing with giant jaws. The male has those jaws, and it's just to hold on to the female while they mate. They can't pinch you with them. They wouldn't break your skin.
And they only live about 14 days.
Yeah.
And I think one of them can't eat, right? Or is that the other fly?
A lot of those things
Yeah. they
can't
just-
eat when they're adults. The hellgrammite will be the hellgrammite for about 3 or 4 years. It'll be very tiny when it hatches and grow to 3 inches. And then the adult, which we think, well, that's the bug. The adult is the bug. The rest is all just preliminaries. The bug lasts 2 weeks. So really, that animal is that thing. It's its juvenile form.
My dad used to fish with them and he
Yeah.
put them in his hat.
Oh yeah, they probably latch on and just hold on without any help.
So,
That they used to have shrimp in these, some of these rivers?
Not that I know of, although there are fairy shrimp that show up in our vernal pools, which are the forest pools that hold water for a few months. That's where a lot of frogs and dragonflies and so on reproduce.
salamanders, yeah.
Yeah, salamanders.
I've heard that there were shrimp in some of these streams, and I've been a long time ago.
It is certainly true that
I don't remember where they are.
certain little, I want to say ostrich, I'm looking for the, anyway, those little critters do live in Ohio. I don't know that they live in our streams, but they live in ponds.
So if you want to become a national river, scenic river, you have to have a few other things. that are special about you, but the Ohio River, the Little Miami River is the only river in Ohio whose full length is declared a scenic river. And it starts in Clifton. If you've ever been to the Clifton Mill for pancakes, it starts right there and goes all the way down to the Ohio River. Flows through 5 counties, and it's within 30 minutes of over 3 million people.
You'd be surprised how many people up in the middle main stem and the headwaters, like the Corwin, Morrow, Waynesville, Spring Valley area, they think that the Little Miami flows into the Great Miami, and that's why they're named that way.
Yeah.
Isn't that
It used
weird?
to. There was a time right after the glaciers where part of the Little Miami River flowed through the ancient Lebanon Creek, and it flowed into the Great Miami, but after the glaciers it didn't do that anymore. But you have to be scenic, and this is one of our favorite pictures of the Little Miami in the summertime. And it's a lot of wildlife to it. It's a great corridor. In some ways, the rivers, particularly the scenic rivers, are our longest state parks and preserves because they connect wide spaces and they allow animals to go up and down instead of having to stay into a round area that might be a park.
I don't see any wildlife in that upper left-hand.
No, but
Are there any in the lower right?
there's a little deer down there.
There you go. Yeah.
Little deer and
2 of them.
yeah. And it's got a lot of great recreational opportunities. People and dogs love it. Fishermen love it. Paddlers love it. And it has great potential in that way. The Little Miami has great geological formations to it. And
It's from the Yellow Springs area, Clifton Gorge. You've been up there? That's the same layer of limestone and dolomite that you see at Niagara Falls. It's found all over the upper Midwest because there was a continental shallow sea, much like the Florida Keys or the Bahamas, where carbonates were drifting out. And they solidified and formed this rock layer, which is regional in extent. And it's called the Niagara Escarpment because the Niagara Falls are the most famous expression of it.
I bet you didn't know we were connected to the Niagara Falls.
We
did you?
definitely are. Yep.
His historic, all of the rivers at one time were the roads for the Native Americans and for the early pioneers. And it was up the Little Miami River Valley that General St. Clair sent the troops, and all of the early pioneers in military forces out of Cincinnati and the fourth that was down here.
2 failed expeditions before he finally succeeded in his goals.
And it was the first railroad.
No, I'm thinking of Wayne was the one who succeeded.
Yeah, it was the first path for the railroad, and now that railroad is the bike trail. You can see the trains going up there. There's an old mill from Clifton Gorge area. At one time, the Little Miami had over 300 mills on its main stem in the tributaries.
There were 16 lined up at Waynesville alone. There was a mill race, and they just each dipped their wheels, and you know the water doesn't wear out; it continues to flow downhill.
But it got so that it was so uneven that they couldn't depend on water source for energy anymore. When a lot of the trees in the watershed were cut down, and it changed the flow of the water. And
when the trees are all cut down, the water table starts to drop, and so the rivers didn't flow as constantly as business needed them. So they went to electric, which was just developing.
But I think a lot of that is happening now. If you're a paddler, you know the river goes up and down very fast, and it might be because there's a lot less trees and more development in the area. It's got great archaeological features. Fort Ancient is very close by. This area of the river has been declared a important sustainability area by the Nature Conservancy because plants and animals can move north and south along the riverbed, but also up and down along the hillsides around Fort Ancient. Hopefully by 2021, 2022, it'll become part of the World Heritage Site, and we may get 30,000 new visitors and tourists.
Part of the what site?
World Heritage Site. The Ohio Department, the Ohio Historical Center and the
Used to be the Ohio Historical Society, now it's Ohio History Connection.
Yeah.
They rebranded.
Yeah, we remember.
Yeah.
Yeah,
figured.
they are trying to get the Hopewell Ceremonial Sites as a World Heritage designation, and that would be Fort Ancient, the mounds in the Chillicothe area, and then the mounds over in the Newark area. So it'll be a great way to increase tourism to the state.
Serpent Mound as well?
It's a separate nomination, because at
Yeah.
the time they were putting together the Hopewell nomination, they weren't sure that Serpent Mound was Hopewell in age. There were some charcoal dates that seemed to indicate it was Fort Ancient in age, which is much later, like 1,000 years later.
Even though this is called Fort Ancient, it's really Hopewell.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, here's what happened. There's the South Fort, and some of the early archaeologists, like at the end of the 1800s, they found a village site here and they excavated it. And they said, oh, this is an interesting new culture. We've seen clues before, but this is really the type site. So we're going to call this a culture, and we're going to call it the Fort Ancient culture because it's in Fort Ancient. It turns out that was an invasive species. This thing had existed for 1,000 years before the Fort Ancient people showed up and thought, this is kind of a cool place. Let's put a village here.
So let's hope.
It's already got the
Hopewell
walls.
built Yeah.
All
Yeah.
kinds of things. Blue jackets, you tell me, Fort Ancient.
We're sorry we're blowing all of your knowledge.
Sorry.
Biological diversity and studies. We learned today that the number of species of freshwater mussels on the Little Miami are decreasing. The quantity are increasing, not only the species count, but the quantity. At one time, there were big industries along the Middle Miami where they made pearl buttons out of the shells, and they even gathered the shells, the pearls out of them to make
The
necklaces.
little
and
lumpy
things.
freshwater pearls. There was a
Yeah.
pearl industry in Waynesville. Just imagine how many millions of
Thousands.
freshwater mussels they killed
Yeah.
just to find the ones that had the pearls. And now they're in such steep decline. If you go to your doc, he takes vital signs, right? There are a few things you know. You're going to get weighed, respiration. He's going to listen to your heart, take your pulse, blood pressure. Well, if you're assessing the health of a river, there are basically 4 vital signs you look for. You look at the chemistry. Is chemistry all right? Everything in balance? Are the fish all here? Are there any fish missing? Are there any species we would expect to find that aren't here? You'd look at the macroinvertebrates, which are the bugs that live under the rocks. Because remember, they have to weather every insult that comes by. So if they're missing, that tells you an insult came by. Something happened in the last few months. What killed all the bugs? Freshwater mussels would be the 4th thing you'd look at. The other 3 are doing well, but the mussels are not, and it's mysterious. Even the experts can't tell us what to look at. They have a few vague ideas, but that's as good as it gets. Even the invasive freshwater mussel around here, which is the Asian clam, it's equivalent to bush honeysuckle terrestrially. I mean, they're just thick. Even they're gone. Wow.
Yeah. So
Well, that's good on one hand, but it's a
the
little
zebra
worse.
mussel was in the Little Miami, but it's not there
The
anymore.
zebra mussel, right.
Yeah. And
A
no one
certain
knows
species-
why.
Yeah, freshwater drum learned how to eat them. Freshwater drum have dental apparatus in their throats. Fishermen refer to them as croakers because sometimes when you're pulling them up, they'll grind those things out of stress and anxiety, and it makes an audible noise. They were designed, you might say, those fish prey on not only small mussels but also snails. Well, when the zebra mussels showed up, they had an unlimited food source all to themselves, and they quickly learned how to eat them. So anyway, they are now living in parts of the river systems they never used to be able to compete in.
So one of the most important things is that we're 95% exceptional warm water habitat, which is the highest ranking a river can get
It's
in the
better
state.
every few years.
Yeah,
Where are the mussels, though?
yeah, we
We
don't
don't
know. And it's a great tourist asset, an economic asset, if we don't blow it by ruining the water.
Did they ever think about importing some to restart?
They grow them in zoos. In fact, the Columbus Zoo is part of a program, and some of the especially rare and endangered mussels have been transferred into Big and Little Darby, and it seems like, was it the Cocosing we heard about?
I think so, yeah.
So far, not the Little Miami. But Hope and I were talking on the way down here, what we ought to do. You've heard of that seed storage place in Norway, I think it's above the Arctic Circle, where they're trying to preserve seed stock from every cultivar from every country. We ought to be doing that with freshwater mussels so we can repopulate once we figure out what's going on. And it may be 10 years from now, but we don't want the seedbed to go extinct.
Yeah. So here's a close-up picture of the Little Miami Watershed. You can see the river that starts up in Clark County and goes down to the Cincinnati area.
And see how almost all the watershed is on the east side? It's all that agricultural land.
But
The watershed divided between the Great Miami watershed and the Little Miami is actually very close to the Little Miami along most of its route.
Yeah, but you can see all that yellow and gold and orange on the west side of the Little Miami. That's all hardscape. And one of the Glenn Compson's great fears was that the Cincinnati area and the Dayton area would merge and would become all hardscape and ruin his favorite river.
Even back in the 60s, he could see that coming, and now we're living through it.
You mean streets and?
Streets and houses and pavement and even
Development.
football fields, anything that it's hard for water to get in through and to.
Yeah, I used to think, oh, well, gravel roads, that's a good idea. Gravel park.
Yeah.
No, they become so compacted that they're not absorbent either, and the water runs off of them. Play fields and parks that are heavily used, they're not considered absorbent surfaces.
So if you walk on it too long, it's going to get
And the
tough.
mowing apparatus compacts the soil.
Well, you know, it's a dirt road if it gets run over on, that's not.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
You get ruts and you get puddles, don't you?
Yeah, that's proof. The standing water is
Yeah.
right there
Yeah.
for everybody to see.
It doesn't show the East Fork of the Little Miami on it.
That's that gray area right there.
Reservoir, and here's the East Fork, and here's
Okay.
what's the upstream part, I think this.
That's far down, okay.
By the way, the East Fork is the last best place for freshwater mussels. That's where they're surviving best. Yep.
The East Fork and Cedar Creek were the two rivers that were dammed when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers thought it was great to dam rivers. They wanted to dam the main stem, the big part, and the trade-off was that they would get to dam the two main tributaries
Yeah.
and make lakes.
Which should help keeping the water flow up, though. I mean, if they.
Well, the
let
dams,
water-
it depends on when they let the water out of the dams, and they don't really tell you when they're going to let the water out,
Yeah,
so
it's funny
canoers
you-
can't really.
It's funny you'd mention that because the Corps of Engineers, being a federal agency, is not very responsive to local concerns, so the livery operators pull their hair out. Like this year, they had almost no viable business days until the 4th of July weekend. The spring rains just kept coming, all through June, washed out. Finally, 4th of July weekend, we're going to have good weather, and then the Corps announces, oh, we're going to release water from our lakes because they've been too high due to the spring rains. So the 4th of July weekend got washed out. And I know one livery operator that had to take out a small business loan to get through the season, and another guy came to us and offered to sell us some property to get him through the season. I mean, he was selling his infrastructure.
And they, in London, had a sewage leak where they shut it down for a week or two.
Yeah, that's right.
Right at the
At the peak.
right at the monkey bar.
Yeah.
And it's okay to call it the monkey bar. That's its official name now.
Yeah.
Remember when it was named for that
I
chimp?
remember
that
when the
used to sit
monkey was in there, yeah.
Yeah.
When you say they came to you to offer to sell land, who is we? Who is?
The Scenic River program.
The Department of Natural Resources.
Oh, ODNR.
Yes,
Okay,
ODNR, yeah.
there isn't a separate entity
No.
that owns land along.
No.
Well, there are a lot of land conservancy districts like the Little Miami Conservancy. It used to be Little Miami Inc. is now called Little
Yeah.
Miami Conservancy.
Tecumseh Land Trust.
Tecumseh Land
Every
Trust.
park district is
Cardinal,
basically a land conservancy if you think of it.
yeah, Cardinal Land Trust. There are a lot of those that own property or are conservation easements.
And the Scenic River program itself owns a few thousand acres because it's kind of a beloved program by people like Glenn Thompson. So people would will land to the Scenic River program upon their death. It'd be a bequest. And so we end up having parcels here and there. A lot of times, if they're big enough, we will lease them to a local park district to operate as a public park. Like the Narrows Reserve in Greene County is a nice one. It's got 5 or 10 miles of trails.
So
Yeah.
you do own some, but it's not your main
Right.
focus. is to
No.
buy.
No, we
Yeah.
really don't want to be in the business of managing land because that's a labor-intensive thing. But we do have some.
Are they still doing cleanups
all the
You
time.
know, like 50 years ago.
Boy,
I wrote
that's
a
probably-
big article in
that's
the
a can of worms. We
Dayton
could,
Flyer News when I was going to UD about
We have-
land cleanup.
That's how I
Taking
got
out
involved,
thousands of
is
tires.
because I could see all this stuff going down the river that didn't need to
Yeah.
go down the river. So some neighbors and I started
Tires
the,
and
yeah.
cars and.
since
You remember-
2010, we've taken 7 tons of trash out of Greene County and about 900 tires, just in one
Because it-
county.
remember when we were kids, we could collect pop bottles and get 3 cents when I started, 5 cents at the end of my business career, collect pop bottles. We should have that with tires, but you have to pay to get rid of spent tires. You don't get a deposit back. It's reversed. So people have an incentive to throw them off bridges. Farmers dump them in rivers. You know, family farms often have their own dumps on the premises anyway.
So if you look at the population around the Dayton area, you can see that it's sort of leveled off. I don't know about the Cincinnati area, but up there it's kind of leveled off. But if you look at the footprint, we started off in the 1950s with the brown, and now 2010 we're in the purple. So the footprint has really increased, although the population has not increased.
So it's the same number of people, it's just that we've all spread out and urban sprawl has occurred.
And so that makes it a major threat, because all that is hardscape. And the more hardscape you have, the poorer your water quality is going to be. And the more drains you're going to have, which is going to make that first flush of rainwater more damaging.
Since settlement times, as hardscape has evolved from 0% up to where we are now, biologists know that as hardscape, as the graph starts to climb from 0% up through 5, 6, 7, you get losses of fish and birds and all the other things that live in the ecosystem. But when it reaches 10% impervious surface in a watershed, then things really start to go off the cliff. That's an inflection point. So we want to stay below 10%. We have some sub-watersheds like the Beaver Creek in the Fairborn area and Duck Creek that are up to 25 to 30% hardscape.
So
we
that
really
makes the
have to-
river work extra hard.
It's a lot of storm water flushed into the river with every big storm. And now the storms are bigger than they used to be. Instead of a 2-inch storm being a remarkable event, we're getting 4 and 5-inch rainfalls.
When we get them.
It's staggering.
Yeah, in the spring. So it's really washing away the banks of all the rivers.
Allows the water.
Pervious concrete. In Chicago now, whenever an alley is rehabilitated, they take up the old asphalt, whatever remains, or brick, or whatever was there, and they put in pervious concrete. It's actually porous. Now, you have to maintain
If that was a lot
it.
more expensive, that makes sense to use it everywhere, I guess.
Yeah, it requires maintenance though, because all those pores get plugged with dirt and stuff. So you have to surge them, and there are trucks that you would go along in the alleys and surge them to clean out the pores. But see, they don't want all that dirty flush going into Lake Michigan. Yeah, Lake
Freezing
Michigan.
weather will get rid of the concrete too.
Well, freezing weather. Yeah.
Potholes, yeah. This is part of the problem, is just you can see that the rainfall in the area is increased greatly and has no indication that it's going to fall down. And that brings the more water through the culverts, and you can see how muddy that water is out of the culvert. That's all sediment that's coming into the river, which is going to change the bottom from rocky bottoms, going to cover up the mussels because they can't move. It's going to
The fish can't spawn. They need clean gravel.
Yeah.
So it's death by 1,000 cuts. Millions of those culverts, really more than thousands.
And those flash floods, what does they do for you? So, well, they cut down the banks. You can see all those orange roots. Those are from the Osage orange tree, which are very hardy trees. They do not like to decay, but the roots are being exposed, and then someday all those trees are going to fall into the river and look like the ones in the foreground.
And that's all our topsoil. That's what agriculture depends upon.
And when those trees fall into the river, we get log jams such as this, which changes the flow of the river, makes backups, makes the river make new channels. And
with all the ash trees dying and falling into the river. So it's not only bank erosion that's causing collapse of the trees into the river, it's the dead ash trees.
yeah, it's
These things are a big problem. They cause so much flooding.
It causes
Traffic
flooding, parks under water so that you can't use them anymore. the flood plains fill up and bring sediment into the rivers. And that sediment changes the ecology of the river. And you can see that was taken at Spring Valley, which is a very rural, green, grass-covered area, but you can see even that area has a lot of dirt going into the river. And so why do we want to save this river and all the other scenic rivers, and in fact all of our rivers? It's because they're important. We use 83% of the water and the groundwater and the aquifer under the Little Miami River.
You might think, wait a minute, the river and groundwater are two different things. No, they're hydraulically connected. It's all one thing. When you go out today or tomorrow, can't today, it's a little dark, but look at the surface of a river, you're looking at the water table. Mm-hmm. If you go back and put a well in the bank 50 yards back, the water level is going to be the same as the river level. The river is the surface of the water table. So it's all one hydraulically connected system. Mm-hmm. Like if you have a plume of gasoline in your groundwater from an old gas station that didn't have fiberglass storage tanks under the parking lot. You know, a gas station has giant gas reservoirs under the parking lot. You're aware of that, right?
They're always going to leak, yeah.
Yeah, in the old days they were steel and they would corrode, and eventually they all failed eventually. Anyway, if you've got a plume of gasoline soaking in through the groundwater, well, that groundwater is all moving, and geologists can figure out where it's moving. You just put wells all over the place and you get data and you figure out how it's drifting. And then you put interceptor wells in there and you suck that contaminated groundwater out and clean it. But it's worky. Let's just keep it clean in the first place rather than having to do all that work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if it's gasoline, you're lucky. What if it's a radionuclide?
Mm-hmm. Or plastic.
Gasoline's easy to clean, and sometimes it is, yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of things in the water, such as excess medicines and plastics from your toothpaste and everything else that we don't think about going into the water, that is very hard to be cleaned out either through the wastewater treatment plants or through the clean water purification plants.
A wastewater treatment plant is nothing but a compost pile that is engineered to run continuously on an accelerated cycle so that all the compostable material, that's all human waste is after all, right? It's the same thing as leaves and grass clippings. It's just organic material. But you can leave your compost heap over the winter and then in the spring you've got some soil to work into your garden. Well, a sewage treatment plant has to do that in 24 hours or maybe 6. The throughput has to be quick because there's more where that came from and we got to get this stuff out of here. It's simply a compost pile. And it's not meant to deal with birth control medicine and depression medicine and high blood pressure medicine.
Mm-hmm. And fish don't need any of that.
And it all comes out the backside and it proves to be affecting. Like there's a study on the
Maybe
south
that's
branch
the trouble
of the
with the
Potomac,
mussels.
and all the smallmouth bass were feminine. They were all females because of the estrogen in the water from birth control pills.
Where was that?
South branch of the Potomac. Yeah, I think it's probably in Maryland, maybe Virginia.
And 2 miles,
5-minute warning.
2 miles off of Seattle, they found opioids in the critters that live on the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. We had 5 minutes to do 41 slides.
So we're going to race. Are you all ready for? But it's a great economic.
Proximity to the river increases the value of your house. Most of the businesses having to do with tourism are family-run businesses. Mm-hmm. They're not by big conglomerates where the money leaves the valley. They're bait shops and bike shops and bed and breakfasts. And now they're Airbnbs, which none of us are even aware of unless we go on the website and figure those out. So all kinds of small businesses, family-owned, and they don't require a college degree to operate. Think of that as $100,000 worth of upfront training. And farm families are worried about all their kids leaving and dispersing because they don't want to be farmers. But if they can run a canoe livery off the backside of the property, well, maybe the family can stay together after all.
And we need it for our children and our grandchildren. We need them to have the same experiences as young people as we had.
Which means we have to be doing the saving right now or they won't have it.
Right.
We have to do this work now.
Right. And so what can you do? Well, you can talk to your local government. You can be involved in zoning, upgrading zoning codes and land use plans because they're all citizen-led. And every government is looking for people who will volunteer to be parts of these committees.
And I always remember the thing you told me when Bob, when the former governor was a county commissioner in Hamilton County. You told me that 10 letters would get his attention. So a county commissioner in one of our major counties, all it takes is you and 9 friends, and you can influence policy. That's not a heavy lift.
You can at least get them to look at it seriously. So
By the way, this would
do
be a
it.
great place to end.
Yeah.
What else do we have to say?
Oh, well, there's best practices, and what we want to do is make sure that what we do as communities is sustainable, and so that we have looked at what happens to people, what happens to the environment, and what happens economically, so that we can come to a happy medium in the middle there. And as a group, we put on medallions on drains to keep people, to help remind them that only water goes down there.
Yeah, most people think that water is going to a sewage treatment plant. It's
Yeah,
going right into the local
river.
stream
Yeah.
with the trash and the diapers and whatever else is in there.
We put up signs to let people know where the watershed is, and we do cleanups.
Yeah.
And this is one morning activity on one 2-mile section of the Little Miami River.
We've
No
done.
excuse for that.
Yeah,
Lots of reasons, but no excuse.
So we just like to involve people of all ages, and we have a river festival to help educate, and we have a Trailblazer Adventure where we, again, try to educate families.
It's kind of a scavenger hunt, and each place where you find a prize, there's a little lesson you have to learn to answer the questions.
So it's a great way for families to learn together and to have a good time. And we hope that the next 50 years will bring better care of the river, and that, as one of our volunteers says, this is not the high water point of the life of the Little Miami River or any of our rivers. Bob always said that in the future, Ohio is going to be the mecca of the world, because we have lots of water with the Great Miami, with the Ohio River and all our lakes and rivers and the Lake Erie at the top. But if we don't take care of it, people are not going to want to come here when they don't have any water. So help us any way you can. Make sure that we have good, clean water and recreational opportunities for our children and our grandchildren, because it's really important. So there's things you can do. We have a handout that has the 10 steps for what you can do around your property.
Yeah, just what a homeowner can do.
But invite us to speak to your groups, and we've really enjoyed being here. Join us and help us any way possible, and keep involved, and talk to your local officials and your neighbors about how we all need to work together to keep the water clean. And thank you.
Sitting up,